Welcome back to the Listening Post report on the U.S. media and the double standard in what is and isn't reported in American news outlets. We're turning our attention now to one of the most venerated institutions in U.S. journalism, the New York Times. Often the standard by which reporters measure themselves editorially and creatively, the Times has, since 9/11, found itself under fire for some well-publicized failings in reporting that had real implications on security issues. Meenakshi Ravi now on the paper that promises all the news that's fit to print, the media war over Pentagon propaganda, and in this case, the prison at Guantanamo Bay.
The problems are pretty much right there in the headline. 1 in 7 detainees rejoined jihad, Pentagon finds.
The problem with this story was that it was just flatly inaccurate.
This really was nothing more than Pentagon propaganda, and it made it onto the front page of one of the most respected newspapers in the United States.
And it did not stop there.
You've got the lead story, Elizabeth, today in the Times, where you point out that in an unreleased Pentagon report, 1 in 7 detainees who are released returned to jihad.
Like most news reports, it replicated.
An unreleased Pentagon report concludes that 1 in 7 Gitmo detainees released from the facility has returned to terrorism. Now, according to the New York Times, the full report has not been released.
And spread like a virus.
14% of the detainees released under President Bush, that's 74 out of 540, returned to terrorism.
That rate has been slowly but steadily rising, and Pentagon officials expect it to go still higher by the time Guantanamo is closed.
The story was broken by the New York Times in May of this year, in the midst of a huge political debate in the United States over the future of Guantanamo Bay and the prisoners held there. The byline belonged to the paper's Pentagon correspondent, Elizabeth Boomiller, and her report immediately came under criticism.
Well, let's start with the 1 in 7.
Clearly, by stating that prisoners have returned to the battlefield, it suggests that they were on the battlefield in the first place. And as we know, the majority of the Guantanamo prisoners weren't captured on the battlefield.
And therefore, whether or not they could re-engage in terrorism is an open question.
And what does re-engaging in terrorism, or as the Times put it, rejoining the jihad, actually mean?
Some of the best work on this has been done by Mark Denbo at Seton Hall, and his research has shown that, for example, the Pentagon has classified as acts of terrorism engaged in by freed prisoners such things as writing an op-ed for the New York Times or appearing in a film about Guantanamo.
Returning to the battlefield includes speaking out in the media about the treatment that was received. So the Tipton Three, who are 3 guys who were involved in a film about their experiences, The Road to Guantanamo, have at some point or other counted as being recidivists who've returned to terrorist activities. I mean, that's absolutely extraordinary.
Back in 2002, the Bush administration used the New York Times to sell a war. On one occasion, it leaked a false story to the Times about Saddam Hussein's nuclear program, and then Vice President Dick Cheney quoted the Times on air to make the case for invading Iraq.
There's a story in the New York Times this morning. This is, and I want to attribute to the Times. I don't want to talk about, obviously, specific intelligence sources.
2 years after that, the Times admitted its journalistic failings in the run-up to the war, in an editorial that said its reporting lacked rigor, was insufficiently challenging, and should have been more aggressive. The Times public editor Clark Hoyt issued a similar mea culpa on the Guantanamo story, saying the reporter and editors were not nearly skeptical enough. He called the article seriously flawed, greatly overplayed, and he even raised the I word, Iraq.
I think it's important, too, that the New York Times public editor suggested that the New York Times coverage of this story ought to be compared to the New York Times failures to adequately report skeptically the problems leading up to the Iraq War.
He actually linked it to the New York Times' coverage in the run-up to the Iraq War and said, you know, look, the problem there was a failure to be skeptical, and here is this same problem again. So it was actually an unusually strong response from the Times' public editor.
They're never going to be able to completely set the record straight, of course, because that talking point, that headline of 1 in 7 returns to terrorism is now part of the political debate. And of course, that's something that's troubling.
Minak Shiravi reporting. Here at the Listening Post, we've done multiple stories on the Times, often critical of mistakes made by America's most influential newspaper. But rewind to April 2008, and it was a very different story. Far from being accused of acting as a mouthpiece for the Pentagon, the Times did some terrific reporting, exposing a pundit program that placed retired pro-Pentagon generals on air across the U.S. media networks at a critical time, when the Bush administration was selling America on the war in Iraq. The Pentagon abolished the program after the Times article was published, and the news channels and papers that played along with the propaganda game ignored the story. Next up on the Listening Post, the story of the Pentagon pundits and the picture it painted about the U.S. military's relationship with the news media there.
Are these retired military officials really just puppets of the Pentagon?
A better question might have been, were the media just puppets of the Pentagon?
Remember when it started and it was kind of a big deal that some journalists were embedded with the troops? Well, this is great. As it turns out, it was more of an exchange program because they actually also had troops embedded with the journalists.
Which would be funnier if this story wasn't so serious. As the New York Times reported in the paper and on its site, in April of 2006, when 6 U.S. retired generals were making news by criticizing the Pentagon's strategy in Iraq, the U.S. military launched a media counteroffensive.
You know, this is a 50-year war. There's not going to be any short-term solution to this.
The Times obtained minutes of meetings involving the then Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, his head of communications, Tory Clark, and another group of retired generals they summoned to Washington.
To the Pentagon, they were known as, quote, message force multipliers, surrogates who would reliably echo administration talking points as if they were their own views.
This is the best leadership our military has had.
Here's an example of one of the messages the retired officers were given by the Pentagon before they were sent into action on the U.S. airwaves.
In one of your speeches, you ought to say, everybody stop for a minute and imagine an Iraq ruled by Zarqawi.
The message needs to be, imagine an Iraq. Imagine Iraq under the control of Zarqawi. That's the message that has to get out to the American people.
It was obvious that they were not neutral and they were not independent. But what we learned from the New York Times is just how dependent these people were.
Appreciate you're plugged in, and I want everybody to know the general knows what he's talking about.
The Times story made a big splash at the Pentagon, which killed the pundits program, but it got very little coverage on the networks that put the military men on the air. PBS, a publicly funded channel, did the story, or at least tried to.
And for the record, we invited Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, CBS, ABC, and NBC to participate, but they declined our offer or did not respond.
The question is whether many of these analysts have been less independent.
CNN had a very short report on it, and it was biased. You see now that the Pentagon was releasing false information about Iran, and the networks were going for it hook, line, and sinker, just like when they went for the White House deceptions about Iraq 5 years earlier.
Before it canceled the pundits program, the Pentagon told the New York Times it was no big deal. The intent and purpose of this, a spokesman said, is nothing other than an earnest attempt to inform the American people.
Well, it's their job to say that that's true. It's going to be a cold day in hell before the Pentagon officials stand up and say, well, yeah, part of our job is to lie to you. In point of fact, though, that is part of their job. It shouldn't be the job of journalists, though.
General Wayne Downing, General Montgomery Meigs, and Colonel Ken Howard.
The analysts were no longer in uniform, but many still held conflicts of interest. As the Times story detailed, it is common for former officers to go to work for military contractors who profit when America goes to war.
So they were not only dependent on the Pentagon for talking points and spin and propaganda points, they were actually dependent on saying the right things on television in order to keep the money, the military contracts coming into the corporations that they currently work for.
For all the criticism the Pentagon pundit story lays at the feet of big U.S. media, it's worth noting that the story did become public through that media. The New York Times spent 2 years working on this story and sued the Pentagon to get the relevant documents.
We should acknowledge that this sort of problem is not unique to the United States and the American government. One of the big differences is that the United States is pretentious about its freedom, and so the hypocrisy is larger. Another major difference is the United States has the most powerful military in the world and implements such horrific violence as has been the case in Iraq. But that fundamental question is still with us. To what extent are the news media being independent?
Here's a postscript to that story. The author of the New York Times pundit piece, David Barstow, won this year's Pulitzer Prize for journalistic excellence for his work on that report. When he was asked upon winning the prize how many interview requests he had received from the U.S. news networks that he had reported on, he said the answer was none. That's our look at the issue of double standards in the U.S. media. Next week, our feature series continues with a report on the most difficult places for the news media to do their work, media black spots around the world. We'll see you then at The Listening Post.